The first light of dawn crept across the ancient city of Ouagadougou like a whispered prayer. The sun, still tender in its morning youth, painted the earth in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows that stretched from the mud-brick walls to the weathered acacia trees that lined the dusty streets. This was the hour when the city held its breath, suspended between the dreams of night and the struggles of day. In the distance, the call to prayer echoed from the minaret of the central mosque, its melodic voice weaving through the narrow alleys, where families were already stirring. The aroma of millet porridge and fried plantains drifted from courtyards where mothers bent over charcoal braziers, their colorful headscarves catching the morning light. Children's laughter mixed with the bleating of goats and the rhythmic pounding of mortars as women prepared the day's first meal. This was Burkina Faso awakening, a nation of resilient people who had learned to find beauty in hardship, hope in uncertainty, and strength in community. Yet beneath the surface of this morning ritual lay deeper currents of struggle that touched every family, every child, every mother who counted coins before deciding whether to buy medicine or food. President Ibrahim Traoré had risen before the sun, as was his custom. In his modest quarters at the presidential compound, he had performed his morning prayers, then dressed in the simple military fatigues that had become his signature since taking power. Unlike his predecessors, who favored expensive suits and golden watches, Ibrahim chose to dress as he always had, as a soldier of the people. At 35, he carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, yet his eyes still held the fire of the young captain who had led the revolution that brought him to power. His close associates often remarked that he seemed to age months in mere weeks, not from the physical demands of leadership, but from the emotional burden of witnessing his people's suffering. This particular morning, Ibrahim had scheduled an early security inspection at the city's periphery. Intelligence reports had suggested increased activity from extremist groups operating in the northern provinces, and he needed to assess the defensive preparations personally. Unlike many leaders who viewed such situations from the comfort of briefing rooms, Ibrahim insisted on seeing everything with his own eyes. The convoy of 3 vehicles moved through the awakening city like a gentle current rather than a rushing flood. Ibrahim had specifically ordered his security detail to avoid the dramatic sirens and road blockades that previous administrations had used. "How can I understand my people's struggles," he often said, "if I clear them from my path?" As they passed through the commercial district, vendors were arranging their wares on wooden tables and colorful mats spread across the ground. Pyramids of oranges and mangoes gleamed in the morning light. Women balanced baskets of tomatoes on their heads while children helped sort vegetables by size and quality. The smell of fresh bread from the boulangeries mixed with the dust, kicked up by motorcycles and bicycles weaving between pedestrians. Colonel Sawadago, Ibrahim's security chief, sat in the front passenger seat, his trained eyes scanning every corner, every rooftop, every face in the crowd. But Ibrahim's attention was drawn to different details. The patch job on a bicycle tire held together with wire, the way a mother counted coins 3 times before purchasing a small bag of rice, the resignation in an old man's eyes as he watched. Younger men board a bus heading toward Libya and uncertain futures abroad. "The real security threat isn't in the northern provinces alone," Ibrahim murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "It's in every hospital that turns away children, every school without teachers, every family choosing between medicine and meals." The convoy continued its steady progress toward the city's edge, passing neighborhoods where prosperity gave way to poverty in the span of a few blocks. Here, the paved roads became dirt paths marked with potholes that filled with stagnant water during the rainy season. Children walked barefoot, carrying jerry cans to collect water from communal pumps. Women hung laundry on lines stretched between tin-roofed shacks that provided little protection from either the scorching sun or the seasonal floods. It was in one of these neighborhoods that Ibrahim's morning routine would be forever altered. The convoy rounded a bend near the Tanghin Dasuri district. Ibrahim's sharp eyes caught something that made his chest tighten. Walking along the roadside, moving with the determined yet weary gait of someone who had been walking for hours, was a small figure carrying an even smaller burden. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her yellow dress, once bright and cheerful, was now stained with dust and sweat. On her back, secured with a colorful wrap in the traditional manner, was a boy who appeared to be barely 4 years old. But this wasn't the comfortable carrying of a sleeping sibling. This was desperation made visible. The boy's head lolled against his sister's shoulder, his small face pale and drawn. His breathing was labored, and even from a distance, Ibrahim could see the sheen of fever on his forehead. The girl's face was streaked with dried tears, but her jaw was set with a determination that seemed far too mature for her young features. Every few steps, she would pause, adjusting her grip on her brother, whispering words that the wind carried away. Sometimes she would wipe her eyes with the back of her small hand, trying to hide the sobs that escaped despite her efforts to be strong. When she stumbled slightly under her brother's weight, she would quickly regain her balance and continue forward, as if stopping for too long might cost them something precious. "Stop the vehicle," Ibrahim commanded, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. The driver, Sergeant Ouedraogo, immediately brought the convoy to a halt, causing the vehicles behind to brake in rapid succession. Colonel Sawadogo's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon as he scanned the area for threats, his training kicking in automatically. "Sir, we haven't completed the security sweep of this area," Sawadogo cautioned, his voice professional but concerned. "Protocol requires—" "Protocol can wait," Ibrahim interrupted, already reaching for the door handle. "That child needs help now." As Ibrahim stepped out of the vehicle, several things happened simultaneously. Pedestrians on the street stopped and stared, some recognizing the distinctive red beret even at a distance. His security detail fanned out in protective formation, their eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways for potential threats. Vendors paused in their morning setup to watch the unusual scene unfold. But Ibrahim had eyes only for the little girl who had frozen in place, her wide eyes taking in the sight of armed men emerging from official vehicles. Fear flickered across her young face, not the fear of a child who had done something wrong, but the deeper fear of someone who had learned that authority figures often brought disappointment rather than help. Ibrahim approached slowly, deliberately, making his movements non-threatening. He removed his red beret as he walked, holding it at his side in a gesture of respect. When he was still several meters away, he stopped and knelt on the dusty ground, bringing himself to the child's eye level. "Little sister," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a beloved uncle rather than the authority of a president. "What is your name? And where are you going this early in the morning?" The girl's lips trembled. She glanced at the guards, surrounding them, then back at Ibrahim's face. Something in his expression, perhaps the genuine concern in his eyes, or the way he had lowered himself to her level, seemed to ease her initial fear. My name is Salimata," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning sounds of the awakening city. "And this is my little brother, Suleimana." She adjusted her grip on the boy, and Ibrahim could see how her small arms shook with exhaustion. The child on her back stirred slightly, letting out a weak whimper that pierced Ibrahim's heart like a physical wound. "Salimata," Ibrahim repeated, investing the name with dignity and attention. "That's a beautiful name. It means peaceful in Arabic, doesn't it? But you don't look very peaceful this morning. You look worried and tired. Can you tell me why?" The girl's composure, so carefully maintained throughout what must have been hours of walking, finally began to crack. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her voice broke as she spoke. "My brother. He's very sick, sir. He has been burning with fever for 3 days, and last night he could barely breathe. I took him to the small clinic near our house in Sissin, but—" She paused, struggling, to find words for adult failures that no child should have to understand. "What did they tell you at the clinic?" Ibrahim prompted gently. "They said they don't have the right medicine for him. They said he needs to go to the big hospital in the center of the city, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her feet. "But what, little sister?" "But I don't have money for a taxi, and the bus conductors won't let me ride with a sick child for free. They're afraid he might be contagious." The words tumbled out now as if a dam had burst. "I've been walking since before the sun came up. I was hoping maybe if I got to the hospital early, they would help us even if we can't pay." Ibrahim felt something cold settle in his stomach. Here was a 10-year-old child, carrying her dying brother across the city because the system had failed. Them at every turn. The clinical reports he received in his office came alive in the form of this dusty little girl with tear-stained cheeks and unwavering determination. "Salimata," he said, rising to his full height but keeping his voice gentle. "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We're going to the hospital together, right now." Before she could respond, Ibrahim carefully lifted the sick boy from her back, cradling him in his strong arms. The child was disturbingly light, and his skin burned with fever even through Ibrahim's uniform. Up close, the symptoms were even. More alarming, the rapid, shallow breathing of someone whose lungs were fighting for every breath. The gray pallor that spoke of a body in crisis. "Colonel," Ibrahim called to Sawadogo, "radio ahead to the university hospital. Tell them we're bringing in a child with severe respiratory distress. I want their best pediatrician waiting for us." As his security team sprang into action, Ibrahim helped Salimata into the lead vehicle, then climbed in beside her, still holding her brother. The girl's small hand found his sleeve and gripped it tightly, as if afraid that this moment of help might disappear like a dream. The University Hospital of Ouagadougou stood as a concrete monument to both ambition and limitation. Built in the 1960s with French development funds, it had been designed to serve as the nation's premier medical facility. 6 stories of pale yellow concrete rose from a courtyard filled with mango trees and benches where families waited with the patience of those who had learned that medical care was often as much about endurance as it was about healing. As Ibrahim's convoy pulled into the emergency entrance, the scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and familiar. The courtyard overflowed with people seeking medical care. Mothers fanning feverish infants with pieces of cardboard, elderly men leaning heavily on walking sticks while they waited for their names to be called, pregnant women shifting uncomfortably on hard benches as they counted the coins in their hands to see if they had enough for the required fees. The emergency entrance itself was a bottleneck of human need. Families pressed against the doors, some carrying patients on improvised stretchers, made from wooden poles and cloth. Others sat on the ground, too weak or too poor to demand attention. The acrid smell of disinfectant mixed with sweat, fear, and the unmistakable odor of illness created an atmosphere that spoke of a healthcare system stretched far beyond its capacity. When Ibrahim emerged from the vehicle carrying Suleimana, with Salimata walking beside him holding his sleeve, a ripple of recognition and confusion spread through the crowd. Nurses and orderlies stopped in their tracks. Patients stared with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief. Security guards straightened reflexively, unsure of the protocol for a president arriving unannounced with a sick child in his arms. Dr. Elizabeth Konate, the emergency department chief, was reviewing patient charts when Nurse Amina burst through her office door. "Doctor, the president is here. He's carrying a child and he's demanding immediate treatment." Dr. Konate, a woman in her early 50s who had dedicated her career to serving the poor despite numerous opportunities to practice privately, felt her heart sink. Presidential visits were usually political theater. photo opportunities that disrupted actual patient care while providing publicity for politicians. But when she hurried to the emergency entrance, she saw something different. There was no media crew, no staged photography. Instead, she saw a man in military fatigues holding a critically ill child while a little girl clung to his side. The expression on the president's face was not that of a politician seeking favorable coverage, but of a man genuinely afraid for a child's life. "Dr. Konate," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying the urgency of a worried parent rather than the authority of high office. "This boy's name is Suleimana. He's been running a high fever for days, and his breathing is becoming increasingly labored. His sister has been carrying him across the city since dawn because your satellite clinic couldn't treat him." As Ibrahim spoke, Dr. Konate was already making her preliminary assessment. The child's condition was indeed serious. Possible pneumonia, potentially life-threatening without immediate intervention. But as the reality of treatment options ran through her mind, she felt the familiar weight of resource limitations settling on her shoulders. "Let's get him to examination room 3 immediately," she called to the nursing staff. "I need oxygen saturation levels, temperature, and chest X-rays stat." As medical personnel sprang into action, wheeling over a gurney and beginning their initial assessment, Ibrahim found himself standing in the middle of the emergency ward, truly seeing it for the first time. The reports he received in his office spoke of capacity challenges and resource optimization, bureaucratic language that sanitized the reality of human suffering. But standing here, surrounded by the sounds of crying children and worried parents, Ibrahim saw the truth behind the statistics. In one corner, an elderly woman lay on a makeshift bed consisting of 2 chairs pushed together because all the proper beds were occupied. Near the entrance, a young father paced frantically, while his infant son struggled with what appeared to be severe dehydration, but the IV fluids he needed were rationed due to supply shortages. "Sir," Dr. Konate approached him with the grave expression of someone about to deliver difficult news. "The boy definitely has pneumonia, and it's advanced. Under normal circumstances, we would put him on supplemental oxygen immediately and monitor him closely." "Under normal circumstances?" Ibrahim's voice carried a dangerous edge. "What exactly are the current circumstances?" Dr. Konate glanced around the crowded ward, then met his gaze directly. "Sir, we have 5 oxygen concentrators in this entire hospital. All 5 are currently in use. We have 2 backup tanks, but they're reserved for surgical emergencies only." The words hit Ibrahim like a physical blow. "You're telling me that in the premier hospital of our nation's capital, we cannot provide oxygen to a dying child?" "The standard protocol," Dr. Konate continued, her voice professional but strained, "is to transfer such cases to the referral hospital in Bobo Dioulasso. The journey takes approximately 4 hours by ambulance. Assuming our single functioning ambulance is available." Ibrahim looked across the room at Salimata, who was sitting beside her brother's gurney, holding his small hand while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. The sight of this brave little girl, who had carried her brother across a city only to be told that help was still hours away, ignited something primal in the president's chest. "Dr. Konate." Ibrahim's voice had become deadly quiet, the tone that his military subordinates had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than shouting. "Are you telling me that we would ask this child to continue suffering for 4 more hours because we have predetermined that soldiers' lungs are more worthy of oxygen than children's lungs?" The doctor's face flushed with a mixture of shame and frustration. "Sir, the protocols exist because we have failed," Ibrahim interrupted. "Show me these reserved oxygen tanks." What followed was a tense march through the hospital corridors that would later be remembered as the moment when administrative convenience collided with moral authority. Dr. Konate led Ibrahim, followed by his security detail and a growing crowd of hospital staff, to a locked room in the surgical wing. The room contained medical equipment that gleamed with the promise of life-saving potential. Oxygen tanks, monitors, emergency medications, all sitting unused behind a locked door while children struggled to breathe just floors away. A sign on the door read, "Military Emergency Reserve, authorized personnel only." "Colonel Sawadogo," Ibrahim called to his security chief. "Break this lock." "Sir, the regulations require authorization from—" "I am the authorization," Ibrahim's voice cut through the bureaucratic hesitation. Every piece of equipment in this room was purchased with the taxes paid by the people of Burkina Faso, including Salimata's mother who cleans houses to feed her children. "Break the lock." The sound of the lock breaking seemed to echo through the entire hospital. As the door swung open, revealing the hoarded medical supplies, word spread quickly through the wards. Patients and families pressed closer, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in the balance of power between need and protocol. Within minutes, orderlies were wheeling oxygen equipment back to the emergency ward. Nurses who had grown, accustomed to apologizing for shortages, suddenly found themselves with the tools they needed to save lives. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Staff members who had been going through the motions of defeat suddenly moved with the energy of purpose. But as Sulemana was finally connected to the oxygen he desperately needed, Ibrahim realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. As evening shadows lengthened across the hospital courtyard, Ibrahim made a decision that would become legendary in Burkina Faso. Instead of returning to the presidential palace, for his scheduled evening briefings, he sent word that all meetings were to be postponed indefinitely. He would be spending the night at the hospital, waiting with Salimata to see if her brother would recover. This decision sent ripples of confusion through the government. Cabinet ministers who had prepared reports were told to reschedule. Foreign dignitaries expecting to meet with the president were informed of the delay. But Ibrahim was unmoved by the protests of his staff. "If I cannot spend one night worrying about a child," he told his chief of staff over the phone, "then I have no business leading a nation full of children." As night fell over the hospital, the building took on a different character. The harsh, fluorescent lights of day were replaced by dimmer evening illumination that cast long shadows in the corridors. The constant stream of visitors and vendors that filled the daytime hours had thinned to a steady flow of families keeping vigil beside sick relatives. Ibrahim had taken up residence in a plastic chair beside Sulemana's bed in the children's ward. The boy's condition had stabilized thanks to the oxygen therapy, but he remained unconscious, his small chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Salimata sat on the edge of the bed, one small hand resting on her brother's arm as if her touch alone could will him back to consciousness. As the hours passed, Ibrahim found himself in conversation with the other families sharing the ward. There was Mrs. Sawadogo, whose infant daughter had been born prematurely and needed constant monitoring. She had been living at the hospital for 3 weeks, sleeping on the floor beside the incubator because she couldn't afford the guest house fees and wouldn't leave her baby alone. In another bed lay a boy about Sulemana's age, who had been brought in after drinking contaminated water from a well that was the only source available to his village. His father, a farmer who had walked 20 kilometers to reach the hospital, sat silently beside the bed, his weathered hands folded in prayer. These were not unusual cases, Ibrahim learned. Every bed told a similar story of families pushed to the breaking point by a healthcare system that treated medical care as a commodity rather than a right. As he listened to these stories, Ibrahim felt the weight of systemic failure pressing down on him like a physical force. Around midnight, Dr. Konate approached with an update on Sulemana's condition. The boy's fever had broken, and his oxygen levels were improving, but the doctor's expression remained troubled. "He's responding well to treatment," she reported. "But, Mr. President, I need to be honest with you about something." Ibrahim looked up from where he had been helping Salimata eat a small meal brought by one of the nurses. "What is it, doctor?" "The oxygen we're using tonight. We've essentially borrowed it from tomorrow's patients." The tank that's keeping this boy alive should have been saved for the emergency surgeries scheduled for tomorrow morning. We've solved one crisis by creating the conditions for another." The stark reality of the doctor's words settled over Ibrahim like a cold blanket. This wasn't just about one child or even one hospital. The entire system was a house of cards where saving one life meant potentially sacrificing another. "How many children die in this hospital each month?" Ibrahim asked quietly. Dr. Konate hesitated, then answered with the honesty of someone who had carried this burden alone for too long. "In the children's ward? Approximately 15 to 20, most from preventable causes: pneumonia, diarrheal diseases, malnutrition complications, conditions that would be easily treatable if we had adequate resources." Ibrahim absorbed this information in silence. 15 to 20 children each month. That was one child every other day, dying not because medical knowledge was insufficient, but because the resources needed to apply that knowledge were unavailable. Multiply that across all the hospitals in the country, and the scale of preventable tragedy became almost incomprehensible. As the night wore on, Ibrahim found himself walking the corridors of the hospital, seeing it through new eyes. In the maternity ward, he met young mothers who had given birth on floors because all the beds were occupied. In the surgical wing, he learned that operations were often delayed for weeks because of equipment malfunctions that could be fixed, with parts costing less than a government minister's monthly fuel allowance. But it was in the morgue that Ibrahim encountered the sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The small room, designed to hold perhaps 10 bodies, contained more than 20. The excess were covered with sheets and laid on the floor. Dr. Konate, who had insisted on showing him the full scope of the hospital's challenges, pointed to a corner where 3 small forms lay. "Children from this week," she said simply. 2 from pneumonia, 1 from dehydration, all treatable conditions. Ibrahim stared at those covered forms for a long moment, imagining Salimata standing here, looking down at her brother, another statistic in the endless catalog of preventable loss. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "Doctor, I need you to prepare a complete report. I want to know exactly what this hospital needs: equipment, staff, supplies, everything. I want specific numbers, costs, timelines. Can you have that ready by tomorrow afternoon?" "Sir, that will take weeks to compile properly." "You have until tomorrow afternoon," Ibrahim repeated. "And doctor, I want you to be specific about what could have been done differently for every child who has died in this hospital in the past 6 months. I want names, circumstances, and required resources. All of it." When Ibrahim returned to the children's ward, he found Salimata asleep in her chair, her head resting on the hospital bed beside her brother's arm. The sight of this exhausted child, who had shown more courage in one day than many adults demonstrate in a lifetime, crystallized his resolve. He gently covered her with a blanket provided by one of the nurses, then settled into his own chair for what remained of the night. But sleep eluded him. Instead, he spent the dark hours before dawn thinking about the transformation that would begin with the morning light. Dawn broke over the presidential palace like a declaration of war. The grand building, with its manicured gardens and ceremonial fountains, seemed to exist in a different universe from the overcrowded hospital wards where Ibrahim had spent the night. As his convoy pulled through the gates, past the honor guard, standing at attention in their pristine uniforms, Ibrahim felt the surreal disconnect between the symbols of power and the reality of powerlessness he had witnessed. The emergency cabinet meeting he had called for 7 a.m. was already generating anxiety throughout the government. Ministers had received only a brief message. Emergency session, healthcare crisis, immediate attendance required. No agenda, no briefing materials, no indication of what had prompted this urgent gathering. As Ibrahim strode through the marble corridors of the palace, Still wearing the same uniform he had put on the previous morning, staff members noted something different in his bearing. Gone was the measured pace of routine governance. In its place was the focused intensity of a military commander preparing for a critical operation. The cabinet room, with its polished mahogany table and leather chairs, gradually filled with the nation's top officials. Minister of Health Dr. Paul Caboret arrived first, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness. Finance Minister André Ouedraogo followed, clutching a briefcase full of budget projections that he suspected might be rendered irrelevant by whatever had prompted this meeting. Defense Minister Colonel Burema Dakuyo entered with the measured stride of a career military officer, while Education Minister Marie Traoré took her seat with the quiet composure of a former teacher who had learned to remain calm in any crisis. The Minister of Interior, the head of the central bank, and several other key officials completed the gathering. When Ibrahim entered the room at precisely 7 a.m., the assembled ministers rose as protocol dictated. But instead of taking his seat at the head of the table, Ibrahim remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture they all recognized from his military days. "Yesterday morning," Ibrahim began without preamble, "I encountered a 10-year-old girl carrying her dying brother across our capital city. Her name is Salimata, and her brother is Sulemana. They are citizens of Burkina Faso, which means they are our responsibility." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces of his ministers. That girl had been walking since before dawn because our healthcare system had failed them, multiple times, at multiple levels. By the time I left the hospital this morning, her brother was alive but barely, and only because I personally intervened to break open supply rooms that contained equipment our own people couldn't access. Minister Caboret shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. President, individual cases, while tragic, don't necessarily represent 15 to 20 children die preventable deaths in our premier hospital every month," Ibrahim interrupted, his voice carrying the sharp edge of barely controlled fury. "That's not an individual case, Minister. That's systematic murder through negligence." The room fell silent. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and quiet coughing ceased as the ministers absorbed the gravity of their president's accusation. Ibrahim began pacing behind his chair, a habit from his military days when he was planning complex operations. "Last night I walked through hospital corridors where mothers give birth on floors, where children suffocate for lack of oxygen that sits locked in supply rooms, where doctors apologize for having nothing to offer dying patients." He stopped, pacing, and placed both hands on the back of his chair, leaning forward to address his cabinet directly. "So I have called you here to inform you that this ends today. Not next month, not after the next budget cycle, not when it becomes politically convenient. Today." Finance Minister Ouedraogo cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. President, the budgetary implications of major healthcare reform are substantial. We would need to conduct feasibility studies, identify funding sources." André, Ibrahim's use of the minister's first name carried an intimacy that made his words more, not less, threatening. "How much did we spend on the Independence Day celebrations last year?" "Approximately 2.8 billion CFA francs. But that included..." "How much did we allocate for the renovation of government offices?" "Sir, that was essential infrastructure." "How much, André?" 4.2 billion CFA francs over 2 years. Ibrahim straightened, his military bearing making him seem to tower over the seated ministers. "So we can find nearly 7 billion francs for parades and comfortable offices, but we cannot find the resources to prevent children from dying in our hospitals." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Minister Caboret, recognizing that his domain was under direct attack, attempted to mount a defense. "Mr. President, the challenges in our healthcare system are complex and long-standing. They cannot be resolved through emergency measures alone. We need systematic reform, proper planning, international consultation." Paul Ibrahim's voice had become dangerously quiet. "How long have you been Minister of Health?" 3 years, sir. And in those 3 years, how many children have died? From preventable causes in our hospitals? Dr. Caboret's face went pale as he attempted to calculate numbers that he had previously viewed as acceptable statistics rather than human tragedy. "Sir, I don't have those exact figures." "Then get them," Ibrahim commanded. "I want a complete audit of every preventable death in every hospital in this country for the past 3 years, and I want it on my desk by the end of this week." He resumed his pacing, his mind clearly working through the logistics of massive systemic change. "Here's what is going to happen, and I want to be very clear that these are not suggestions or requests for your consideration. These are direct orders from your Commander-in-Chief." The military terminology was not lost on the assembled ministers. Ibrahim was not speaking as a civilian leader seeking consensus, but as a commander issuing battle orders. First, within 48 hours, every public hospital in this country will have its emergency reserves unlocked. No more supplies sitting unused. While patients die, Dr. Traoré, you will personally visit each facility to ensure compliance. Second, we will establish an emergency medical supply procurement program. André, I want you to identify 5 billion CFA francs from the current budget that can be immediately redirected to medical supplies and equipment. Cancel non-essential projects, reduce ceremonial expenditures, audit transportation costs. I don't care how you find it, but you will find it. Finance Minister Ouedraogo began to protest, but Ibrahim's raised hand silenced him. Third, Colonel Dakuyo, the military will provide logistical support for medical supply distribution and emergency medical transport. Our trucks and helicopters will serve as ambulances until we can procure proper medical vehicles. Fourth, we will establish a free emergency healthcare program for all children under 16. No child will be turned away from any hospital for inability to pay. The program launches next Monday. The scope and speed of what Ibrahim was proposing left his ministers stunned. Minister Traoré, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Mr. President, these are admirable goals, but the implementation challenges are enormous. We're talking about restructuring major government programs in a matter of days." Ibrahim stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that reminded everyone in the room of his military background. "Marie, yesterday I watched a 10-year-old girl carry her dying brother across this city because we have failed in our most basic responsibility to protect our people. That girl showed more courage and determination in one day than this entire government has shown in years. If she can carry a sick child across a city, we can certainly reorganize some budget line items." He moved to the head of the table and placed his hands flat on its polished surface. "I'm going to tell you all something that I hope you will remember for the rest of your careers in public service. We are not here to manage comfortable bureaucracies. We are not here to maintain the status quo. We are here to serve the people of Burkina Faso. And if we cannot save the life of a dying child, then everything else we do is meaningless." The room remained silent as the weight of his words settled over the assembled officials. "Now," Ibrahim continued, his tone shifting from condemnation to instruction, "Dr. Traoré will coordinate the immediate hospital supply releases. André will work with the central bank to establish emergency funding mechanisms. Colonel Dakuyo will deploy military assets for medical logistics support, and all of you will report back to me every 24 hours with specific progress updates." As the ministers began to nod their understanding and prepare to leave, Ibrahim raised his hand for their attention one final time. "One more thing. Tomorrow evening, I will be holding a public address to announce these changes to the nation. But before that happens, I want every single one of you to visit a public hospital in your constituency. Not announced visits with advanced preparation and staged encounters. Real visits, where you see what our people actually experience when they seek medical care." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each minister. "Because when I address the nation tomorrow, I want to be confident that every person in this room understands exactly why these changes are not just necessary, but urgent. As the meeting broke up and ministers hurried out to begin implementing what seemed like impossible timelines, Ibrahim remained in the cabinet room, staring out the window at the manicured gardens of the presidential complex. In the distance, he could see the city of Ouagadougou awakening to another day of struggle and hope. Somewhere in that city, Salimata was probably sitting beside her brother's hospital bed, still keeping vigil, still believing that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. It was that faith, Ibrahim realized, that had to drive everything they were about to attempt. The news of the president's night-long vigil at the hospital spread through Ouagadougou with the speed of wildfire. In a city where rumors and gossip were the primary currency of communication, the image of the president sleeping in a plastic chair beside a sick child captured the collective imagination in ways that no official proclamation could have achieved. By midday, radio stations were interviewing hospital patients who had witnessed the unprecedented scene. Television news programs ran continuous coverage, with reporters stationed outside the hospital hoping to catch glimpses of the ongoing drama. Social media platforms, despite limited internet access in many parts of the country, buzzed with shared stories and speculation about what this might mean for the nation. But it was in the markets, taxi stations, and neighborhoods where the real conversations were taking place. These discussions carried the weight of lived experience. Mothers who had carried sick children through the night, fathers who had sold belongings to pay for medical care, families who had lost loved ones to conditions that everyone knew could have been treated with adequate resources. At the central market of Ouagadougou, vendor Mariam Ouedraogo was arranging tomatoes when her customer, a seamstress named Aissata Sawadogo, brought up the morning's extraordinary news. "Sister Mariam, did you hear? The president spent the whole night at the hospital with a sick child. They say he broke open locked rooms to get medicine." Mariam paused in her work, a ripe tomato cradled in her weathered hands. "I heard something. On the radio? But you know how these politicians are. Always making promises during crisis, then forgetting when the cameras leave." "But this was different," Aissata insisted, leaning closer over the wooden counter that separated customer from vendor. "My cousin Fatou works as a cleaner at the hospital. She saw him with her own eyes, the president sitting in that children's ward all night like any worried father. No bodyguards hovering, no special treatment, just a man worried about a child." Other customers began to gather around, drawn by the conversation. This was how news truly traveled in Burkina Faso, not through official channels, but through the networks of women who knew each other's struggles intimately. "My sister lost her baby last year at that same hospital," offered Haja Compaoré, a woman selling colorful fabrics nearby. "They told her they didn't have the right medicine, but she could see the locked cabinets full of supplies. She begged them, even offered to pay double, but they said it was against regulations." The group fell silent for a moment, each woman carrying similar memories of bureaucratic indifference in the face of human need. These were not abstract policy discussions. These were personal testimonies of a system that had failed them repeatedly. But if the president really opened those locked rooms, Mariam's voice carried a note of cautious hope. "Maybe things could actually change." "Or maybe it was just theater," said another woman, her skepticism born from years of disappointment. "How many times have we heard promises about health care? Remember when they said they would build new clinics in every district? Where are those clinics now?" As the conversation continued, similar discussions were taking place across the city. In the Gungan district, motorcycle taxi drivers gathered around their usual morning tea spot, debating what the president's actions might mean for ordinary people. At the University of Ouagadougou, students who normally focused on politics and economics found themselves discussing healthcare access with an urgency they had never felt before. But it was in the neighborhood surrounding the hospital that the impact was most profound. Here, families who had experienced the healthcare system's failures firsthand began to allow themselves to believe that change might actually be possible. In the Sisen district where Salimata and Sulemana lived, their neighbor Balkissa Traoré was preparing lunch when she heard the news on her small radio. She immediately left her cooking and hurried to the compound where Salimata's mother, Aminata, worked as a house cleaner. "Sister Aminata, have you heard? Your Salimata is with the president." Aminata looked up from the laundry she was washing, confusion clouding her tired features. She had left for work before dawn, as she did every day, and had no idea that her daughter was missing, let alone that she had embarked on a journey that would change the trajectory of the nation. "What are you talking about, Balkissa?" "Salimata should be at home with her brother." "That's what I'm trying to tell you. She took Sulemana to the hospital, and somehow the president found them on the road. They're saying on the radio that he's been with them all night, that he's demanding the hospital treat the boy for free." The laundry fell from Aminata's hands into the soapy water. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was hearing. Her 10-year-old daughter, who helped with household chores and watched her baby brother while Aminata worked, had somehow attracted the attention of the president of Burkina Faso. "Are you certain? How could this be possible?" Balkissa helped her friend sit down on a low stool, recognizing the shock in her features. "The radio said a little girl was carrying her sick brother when the president's convoy found them. She told him her name was Salimata, and that her brother was Sulemana. It has to be them." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Aminata's emotions cycled rapidly from confusion to fear to hope, and back to fear again. Her daughter was alone, in a hospital with powerful people she didn't understand. But if what Balkissa was saying was true, then maybe, just maybe, her son might receive the medical care she could never afford to provide. "I have to go to them," Aminata said, rising unsteadily. "I have to be with my children. The woman who employs you, will she understand?" Aminata looked back at the unfinished laundry, then at her friend's concerned face. "I don't know. And right now, I don't care. My children need me." The journey to the hospital became a pilgrimage of sorts for Aminata. As she walked the same route her daughter had taken earlier that morning, neighbors and strangers alike seemed to recognize her. Word had spread that this was the mother of the brave little girl who had captured the president's attention. Some offered her rides, others simply words of encouragement, but all seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. When Aminata finally arrived at the university hospital, she found it transformed from the place of bureaucratic indifference she remembered from her husband's final days. There was an energy in the air, a sense of purpose that had been absent during her previous encounters with the healthcare system. Hospital staff who had grown accustomed to apologizing for what they couldn't provide were suddenly scrambling to find solutions. Supply rooms that had remained locked for months were being opened and inventoried. Equipment that had been reserved for hypothetical emergencies was being deployed to address immediate needs. In the children's ward, Aminata found a scene that seemed almost surreal. Her daughter, Salimata, was sitting beside a hospital bed where her son lay breathing steadily with the help of an oxygen mask. But what made the scene extraordinary was the man sitting in a plastic chair on the other side of the bed, still wearing his military uniform, still maintaining his vigil even though the immediate crisis had passed. When Aminata appeared in the doorway, Ibrahim rose immediately, recognizing her from Salimata's features and the expression of overwhelming relief and gratitude on her face. Before he could speak, Aminata fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the sight of her son receiving care that she had never been able to provide. "Please, sister," Ibrahim said gently, helping her to her feet. "Don't kneel before me. I am here as a servant of the people, not as someone to be worshipped." Through her tears, Aminata managed to find her voice. "Sir, I don't understand why you helped my children, but I will pray for you every day for the rest of my life. You have given me back my son." Ibrahim guided her to a chair beside the bed, watching as she tenderly touched Suleimana's forehead and found it cool for the first time in days. "Your daughter saved your son's life," he told her quietly. "All I did was remove the obstacles that should never have existed in the first place." As mother and daughter were reunited, and as Suleimana began to show signs of returning consciousness, Ibrahim made a decision that would further cement his commitment to systematic change. He asked Dr. Konate to arrange for him to address the hospital staff, not just the administrators and department heads, but everyone from surgeons to janitors, from nurses to security guards. The hospital's main conference room had never held such a diverse gathering. Senior doctors sat beside cleaning staff, administrators shared space with cafeteria workers, and nurses who rarely had time for meetings found themselves part of a conversation that would reshape their professional lives. When Ibrahim entered, the room, the usual protocol of standing and formal greetings, was replaced by a more informal atmosphere. He had specifically requested that people remain seated and that the discussion be as direct and honest as possible. "I want to thank all of you," Ibrahim began, "for what you accomplished yesterday and last night. For the first time in years, this hospital functioned as it was meant to function, as a place where human need takes priority over administrative convenience." He paused, looking around the room at faces that showed a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "But I also want to acknowledge that what happened here should never have been necessary. No president should have to personally intervene to unlock supply rooms. No child should have to walk across a city carrying her dying brother. No medical staff should have to choose which patients live and which patients wait." Dr. Konate, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. "Mr. President, we're grateful for your intervention, but we need to be realistic about sustainable solutions. The problems we face aren't just about locked supply rooms. We need more staff, better equipment, reliable supply chains, and adequate funding." "You're absolutely right," Ibrahim responded, "and that's why I'm here to ask for your help in designing those solutions. You are the ones who see the system's failures every day. You understand what works and what doesn't. I need you to help me understand how to fix this properly." What followed was a 2-hour discussion that covered everything from medical supply, procurement to staff training programs, from patient transport systems to emergency response protocols. But more importantly, it was a conversation that treated frontline healthcare workers as partners in solutions rather than simply implementers of policies designed by others. By the end of the meeting, working groups had been formed to address specific challenges, timelines had been established for regular progress reviews, and most importantly, a sense of collective purpose had been established that transcended individual job descriptions. As Ibrahim prepared to leave the hospital, he stopped by the children's ward one final time. Suleimana was awake now, still weak, but clearly recovering. Salimata sat beside him, telling him stories in the gentle voice that had sustained them both through their ordeal. "Salimata," Ibrahim called softly. When the little girl looked up, he continued, "Tomorrow evening, I'm going to speak to the entire nation on television and radio. I'm going to tell them about your courage and about the changes we're going to make because of what you showed us. Would you like to be there with me?" The girl's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Will my brother be well enough to come too?" Ibrahim smiled, struck once again by this child's refusal to consider her own interests separate from her brother's well-being. "We'll ask Dr. Konate, but I think he's going to be just fine." As Ibrahim's convoy finally departed the hospital, the institution he left behind was fundamentally different from the one he had entered 24 hours earlier. Equipment was being redistributed, protocols were being rewritten, and staff members were working with an energy that came from feeling valued and empowered rather than constrained and apologetic. But the real transformation was taking place beyond the hospital walls, in the conversations happening throughout the city and spreading across the country. For the first time in years, people were beginning to believe that their government might actually prioritize their needs over political convenience. The announcement of the president's upcoming address created an atmosphere of anticipation unlike anything Burkina Faso had experienced in recent memory. In a nation where presidential speeches were typically formal affairs focusing on political achievements or international relations, the promise of an address centered on healthcare, prompted by a real child's crisis, struck a chord that resonated deeply with ordinary citizens. Radio stations, recognizing the unprecedented public interest, began featuring call-in programs where listeners shared their own healthcare experiences. The stories that emerged painted a comprehensive picture of systemic failure that went far beyond what any official report had ever documented. Callers described traveling hundreds of kilometers to seek treatment, only to be turned away due to lack of supplies. Others told of selling livestock, jewelry, and household possessions to pay for medical procedures, only to have their loved ones die anyway due to delayed or inadequate care. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the stories of parents who had made the impossible choice between seeking medical care for one child while leaving others without food or school fees. But interwoven with these accounts of hardship were stories of resilience, community support, and the kind of quiet heroism that Salimata had demonstrated. Listeners called in to describe neighbors who had carried sick children to distant hospitals, communities that had pooled resources to help families in medical crisis, and healthcare workers who had used their own money to purchase supplies when official channels failed. In the Sahel region, where security concerns had limited government presence for months, radio remained the primary source of information for many communities. Here, the news of the president's hospital vigil was interpreted through the lens of traditional leadership values, where a chief's legitimacy was measured by his willingness to share in his people's struggles. Imam Umaru Diko, a respected religious leader in the northern city of Djibo, used his Friday sermon to reflect on the moral implications of the week's events. "When the powerful remember that they are servants of the powerless," he told his congregation, "then society begins to function as Allah intended." Similar discussions were taking place in churches across the predominantly Christian South, where pastors found in the president's actions a reflection of the gospel teachings about caring for the least among us. Father Jean-Baptiste Nikiema, speaking to his parish in Bobo Dioulasso, connected the president's vigil to the parable of the Good Samaritan, noting that true leadership required stopping to help rather than passing by on the other side of the road. In the university towns, student organizations that had been critical of the government found themselves in the unusual position of cautiously supporting a presidential initiative. At the University of Ouagadougou, medical students organized volunteer groups to assist in hospitals during the expected surge in patients that might result from improved access to care. "We've been studying diseases and treatments for years," explained Fatimata Sawadogo, a fourth-year medical student. "But we've never seen our education connected to real policy change. If the president is serious about healthcare reform, then we want to be part of the solution." International observers were also taking note. The World Health Organization's regional office issued a carefully worded statement praising Burkina Faso's commitment to healthcare access while offering technical assistance for system improvements. Several European Union diplomats privately expressed surprise at the authenticity of the president's response, contrasting it with the more typical pattern of African leaders making grand promises without personal involvement in implementation. But it was perhaps in the diaspora communities, Burkinabe living in Europe, North America, and other parts of Africa, that the emotional impact was strongest. Social media platforms filled with posts from citizens abroad sharing their own memories of healthcare struggles back home, often accompanied by offers to contribute financially to any genuine reform effort. Dr. Aminata Kabore, a Burkinabe physician, working in a Paris hospital, captured the sentiment of many in a widely shared social media post. For 20 years, I have been sending money home to pay for my family's medical expenses, knowing that the same conditions I treat routinely here become death sentences in Ouagadougou. If President Traoré is serious about change, then maybe it's time for those of us with skills and resources abroad to consider coming home to help build the system our people deserve. As the day of the presidential address approached, the practical preparations being made behind the scenes were as unprecedented as the public interest. Rather than the usual presidential venue, a formal setting in the palace or parliament building, Ibrahim had chosen to deliver his address from the university, hospital's main courtyard with the children's ward visible in the background. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. This would not be a speech delivered from the isolation of power, but from the heart of the healthcare system itself, surrounded by the patients and families whose experiences would guide the promised reforms. Television crews arriving to set up their equipment found themselves working alongside hospital staff who were determined to ensure that the broadcast showcased not just the president's presence, but the daily reality of healthcare in Burkina Faso. Nurses made sure that the cameras would capture the overcrowded wards, the improvised equipment, and the determined faces of families who had traveled great distances for care. Dr. Konate, now effectively serving as an unofficial advisor on the healthcare reforms, had prepared a presentation that would accompany the president's speech. Using charts and graphs that translated bureaucratic statistics into human terms, she was ready to explain exactly what the promised changes would mean for ordinary citizens. But perhaps the most important preparation was taking place in the children's ward, where Salimata was learning to use a microphone and Sulemana was practicing walking short distances without assistance. Ibrahim had insisted that they be part of the address, not as props or symbols, but as full participants in announcing the changes their experience had inspired. "I want people to hear directly from Salimata," Ibrahim had explained to his communications team. "She understands the healthcare system's failures better than any minister or expert. And I want them to see Sulemana healthy and playing, because that's what these reforms are supposed to achieve. Not abstract improvements, but children who get to grow up." The evening before the address, as final preparations were being completed, Ibrahim made one more visit to the children's ward. He found Salimata reading a story to her brother, their mother sitting nearby with knitting that one of the nurses had provided to help pass the long hours of recovery. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Ibrahim asked, sitting down in what had become his regular chair beside Sulemana's bed. Salimata looked up from her book, her expression serious beyond her years. "Uncle Ibrahim, will the things you promised tomorrow really happen? Because many people have promised to help us before, but then they forget." It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Ibrahim was trying to accomplish. In a nation where political promises had too often proved empty, how could he convince this child, and the millions of citizens she represented, that this time would be different? "Salimata," he said carefully, "I cannot promise that everything will change overnight, but I can promise you this. As long as I am president, no child will have to carry their sick brother across the city like you did. And if I ever forget that promise, I want you to remind me." The girl considered this for a moment, then nodded with the solemnity of someone sealing a sacred agreement. "I will remember," she said simply, "and I will remind you if you forget." As Ibrahim prepared to leave, he realized that this conversation had crystallized something essential about the reforms he was proposing. They couldn't be top-down policy, changes implemented by bureaucrats who had never experienced the system's failures. They had to be built on relationships of trust and accountability that connected the highest levels of government to the everyday experiences of ordinary citizens. Tomorrow's address would be just the beginning of that conversation. But looking at Salimata's determined face and Sulemana's recovering strength, Ibrahim felt a confidence that hadn't been present in any of his previous political endeavors. This time, he wasn't just making promises to an abstract population. He was making commitments to specific people whose stories he knew intimately and whose well-being would serve as the ultimate measure of his success. The evening of the presidential address, the university hospital courtyard was transformed into something unprecedented in Burkina Faso's political history. Instead of the usual formal podium setup with distant crowds held back by security barriers, intimate seating arrangements had been created that mixed government officials with hospital patients, medical staff with ordinary citizens, and foreign diplomats with neighborhood vendors who had closed their stalls early to attend. Television cameras positioned throughout the space would broadcast the event live across the nation and to diaspora communities worldwide. Radio stations prepared to translate the address into local languages, ensuring that even the most remote villages would have access to the president's message. But what made the setting truly extraordinary was the decision to hold the event in a working hospital, where the normal rhythms of medical care would continue even as the president spoke. As the sun began to set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the courtyard gradually filled with an audience unlike any that had gathered for a presidential address in the country's history. Families from the surrounding neighborhoods arrived carrying children and elderly relatives, many of whom had never been within close proximity to such high-level government officials. Hospital staff, still wearing their uniforms after completing their shifts, took seats alongside cabinet ministers in formal attire. Medical students sat next to traditional chiefs who had traveled from distant provinces. Motorcycle taxi drivers shared benches with university professors, all united by the shared understanding that they were witnessing something that would reshape their nation's priorities. At 7 p.m. precisely, Ibrahim emerged from the hospital building. But he was not alone. Walking beside him were Salimata and Sulemana, the little girl holding her brother's hand as he took careful but steady steps on his own. Behind them came Dr. Konate and several of the nurses who had participated. In Sulemana's care, their presence serving to emphasize that this evening was about healthcare workers as much as political leaders. The crowd's response was immediate and emotional. Instead of the polite applause typical of formal political events, there was genuine cheering, with many people rising to their feet in recognition of the two children whose story had captured the nation's imagination. Some wiped away tears, others raised their hands in blessing, but all seemed to understand that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance. Ibrahim approached the microphone with none of the ceremonial fanfare usually associated with presidential addresses. He carried no written speech, no teleprompter provided prepared remarks. Instead, he spoke directly from his experience of the previous week, his words carrying the authenticity of personal witness rather than political calculation. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard and into the radio waves that would carry his message across the nation. "1 week ago, I was traveling through our capital city when I encountered a little girl carrying her dying brother. Her name is Salimata, and she is here with me tonight, along with her brother Sulemana, who is alive and healthy because we finally did what we should have been doing all along. We put human need above administrative convenience." He paused, allowing the cameras to focus on the two children sitting in the front row, Salimata's small hand still protectively holding her brother's arm. "But I am not here tonight to congratulate ourselves on saving one child. I am here to acknowledge that Salimata's courage exposed a system that has been failing thousands of children just like her brother. And I am here to announce that this failure ends now." The crowd fell completely silent, sensing that they were about to hear commitments that would go far beyond typical political promises. Tomorrow morning, every public hospital in Burkina Faso will receive emergency medical supplies that have been procured with funds previously allocated to non-essential government expenses. No longer will children die because oxygen tanks sit locked in storage rooms while their lungs fail for want of air. The first wave of applause was spontaneous and sustained, with healthcare workers throughout the audience nodding their approval. of this practical commitment. Within 1 week, we will launch a free emergency healthcare program for all children under the age of 16. No child will be turned away from any hospital because their family cannot pay. This is not charity. This is recognition that healthcare is a right, not a privilege determined by economic status. The applause this time was more emotional, with many parents in the audience understanding immediately what this would mean for their own family's security and peace of mind. Within 1 month, we will have deployed mobile medical clinics to reach communities that have been underserved by our centralized healthcare system. Our military vehicles will serve as ambulances until we can procure proper medical transport. Our schools will serve as temporary health centers when needed. Every resource of government will be mobilized to ensure that distance and isolation no longer determine who lives and who dies. Ibrahim paused to take a drink of water, but his eyes remained focused on the faces in the crowd, faces that reflected a mixture of hope, skepticism, and desperate desire to believe that change might actually be possible. "But I want to be very clear about something," he continued, his tone becoming more serious. "These changes will require sacrifice from all of us. We will reduce government ceremonial expenses by 60% to fund medical supplies. We will audit every government contract to eliminate waste and corruption that diverts resources from essential services. We will ask those who have benefited from government connections to contribute to the common good rather than simply taking from it." The crowd stirred at this direct challenge to the system of patronage and corruption that had long characterized Burkina politics. This was not the usual political rhetoric about fighting corruption. This was a specific commitment with measurable implications. And we will ask for help from our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, from international partners who share our commitment to human dignity, and from civil society organizations that have been working to fill the gaps that government has left unfilled. Dr. Konade, who had been asked to present the technical details of the healthcare reforms, approached the microphone as Ibrahim stepped aside. Her presence at the podium, a working physician explaining policy rather than a politician, making promises, underscored the practical orientation of the proposed changes. "Citizens, what the president has outlined is not just possible, but necessary," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years working within the system's constraints. "We have calculated that the immediate reforms will enable us to treat approximately 15,000 additional children annually who would otherwise go without care." She gestured toward charts that had been set up beside the podium, visual aids that translated policy commitments into concrete numbers that ordinary citizens could understand. The mobile clinic program will reach an estimated 200 rural communities that currently have no regular access to medical care. The free emergency program for children will eliminate the financial barriers that currently prevent approximately 40% of families from seeking timely medical treatment. But it was when Salimata approached the microphone that the evening reached its emotional climax. Ibrahim had to lift her up so she could reach the device, and when she spoke, her small voice carried across the courtyard with remarkable clarity and composure. "My name is Salimata Ouedraogo, and this is my brother Sulemana," she said, gesturing toward the little boy who was now standing beside the podium with the help of one of the nurses. "A week ago, I thought my brother was going to die because the hospital said they couldn't help us. But Uncle Ibrahim helped us, and now I want to tell all the other children that if you get sick, the hospital will help you too." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Many people were openly crying, moved by the combination of this child's innocence and strength, and by the tangible evidence of her brother's recovery standing before them. But Salimata wasn't finished. "Uncle Ibrahim promised me that no other children will have to carry their sick brothers like I did. And I promised him that if he forgets, I will remind him. So I want all of you to help me remember too." As the little girl was helped down from the podium, the crowd rose in sustained applause that seemed to go on for minutes. But more than appreciation, the response carried a sense of collective commitment to hold their government accountable to the promises being made. Ibrahim returned to the microphone for his concluding remarks, but the atmosphere had been transformed by Salimata's simple but powerful words. Citizens, you have heard tonight from a 10-year-old girl who understands responsibility and accountability better than many adult leaders. She has agreed to help me remember the promises we are making, and I ask all of you to join her in that responsibility. He looked directly into the television cameras that would carry his words to citizens throughout the country and around the world. Every month we will publish detailed reports on our progress in improving healthcare access. Every quarter I will personally visit hospitals throughout the country to assess conditions and hear directly from patients and staff. And every year we will ask citizens like Salimata to evaluate whether we have kept our commitments. As the formal address concluded, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual pattern where officials would depart immediately after such events, Ibrahim and his cabinet members remained in the courtyard, moving among the audience to continue conversations about implementation details, challenges, and expectations. Healthcare workers surrounded Dr. Konate with questions about how the new policies would affect their daily work. Parents approached Ibrahim directly to share their own family's medical struggles. International observers found themselves in detailed discussions with traditional leaders about how the reforms might be adapted to rural contexts. The evening concluded not with formal closing ceremonies, but with the gradual dispersal of an audience that seemed reluctant to leave, as if afraid that departing might somehow break the spell of possibility that had been created. As families made their way home through the streets of Ouagadougou, the conversations continued in taxis, at bus stops, and in courtyards throughout the city. For the first time in many years, people were discussing government policy not with cynicism or resignation, but with genuine hope that meaningful change might actually be possible. And in the children's ward of the university hospital, where Sulemana was spending his final night under medical observation, Salimata sat beside her brother's bed, reading him a story, occasionally looking up at the television screen where replays of the evening's address were being broadcast on the late news. "Did we really talk to the whole country?" she asked her mother, who was sitting nearby with knitting that would soon become a blanket for her recovering son. "Yes, my daughter," Aminata replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the extraordinary turn their lives had taken. "And now the whole country knows how brave you are." Salimata considered this for a moment, then returned to her storybook. "I hope they remember," she said quietly, "because Uncle Ibrahim is going to need help keeping his promises." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Rayo District Hospital, a modest facility serving the rural communities of central Burkina Faso. 6 months earlier, this hospital had been on the verge of closure, with only 2 functioning beds and no reliable source of basic medications. Today, it hummed with the quiet efficiency of a medical facility that had been transformed by the systematic changes promised in that historic evening address. Dr. Salif Sawadogo, a young physician who had returned from training in Morocco to serve his home community, made his morning rounds with a sense of purpose that would have been impossible just months before. The emergency supply program had equipped his hospital with oxygen concentrators, essential medications, and diagnostic equipment that allowed him to treat conditions he had previously been forced to refer to distant facilities. "The difference is not just in the equipment," he explained to a visiting delegation of international health officials who were documenting the reform program's progress. "It's in the knowledge that we can actually help people who come to us. When you know you have the tools to save lives, it changes everything about how you practice medicine." In the children's ward, a bright, newly renovated space that had been expanded using funds redirected from canceled government ceremonies, 5-year-old Moussa Traoré was recovering from pneumonia. His case would have been fatal 6 months earlier, but under the new protocols, he had received immediate treatment without any requirement for payment, and his recovery was progressing exactly as medical textbooks predicted it should. His mother, Ibrahim Traoré, sat beside his bed with the relaxed demeanor of someone whose worst fears had been replaced by confidence in the system caring for her child. "When I brought him here 3 days ago, I was prepared to be told that they couldn't help us," she said. "Instead, they started treating him immediately and told me not to worry about costs. I have never experienced anything like that before." Stories like this were being repeated throughout Burkina Faso as the healthcare reforms took root and demonstrated their practical impact. The monthly progress reports promised during the presidential address had become eagerly anticipated documents that citizens used to track whether the government was keeping its commitments. The most recent report showed remarkable statistics. Child mortality from preventable diseases had decreased by 34% in the first 6 months of the program. Hospital staff retention had improved dramatically as healthcare workers found themselves equipped and empowered to practice medicine effectively. The mobile clinic program had reached 187 previously underserved communities, providing basic care and identifying serious conditions that required referral to better-equipped facilities. But perhaps most importantly, the reforms had catalyzed changes that went far beyond healthcare itself. The success of the Emergency Supply Procurement Program had demonstrated that government resources could be redirected from ceremonial expenses to essential services without compromising the nation's dignity or international standing. This success had encouraged similar reforms in education, infrastructure, and agricultural support. The diaspora response had exceeded all expectations. Dr. Aminata Kabore, whose social media post had captured the imagination of Burkinabe living abroad, had organized a consortium of healthcare professionals who were contributing both financial resources and expertise to the reform effort. Several dozen doctors and nurses had returned permanently to work in the improved system, while others were contributing through telemedicine consultations and training programs. International partners had also responded positively, but in ways that respected Burkina Faso's leadership of its own reform process. Rather than imposing external solutions, organizations like the World Health Organization and Médecins Sans Frontières had provided technical assistance and resources to support the locally designed improvements. In Ouagadougou, the university, hospital where the transformation had begun, continued to serve as a model for other facilities throughout the country. Dr. Konate, now serving as the National Coordinator for Healthcare Reform, had established training programs that were producing a new generation of healthcare workers equipped not just with medical knowledge, but with understanding of how to work within resource-constrained environments. The children's ward where Sulemana had recovered had become something of a pilgrimage site for families throughout the region. Parents would bring their children not because they needed treatment, but because they wanted to see the place where the healthcare revolution had begun. The staff had learned to balance their medical responsibilities with their role as symbols of what government service could accomplish when properly focused and supported. On this particular morning, a familiar figure appeared in the ward's doorway. Ibrahim Traoré, keeping his promise to visit hospitals regularly throughout the country, had arrived for one of his unannounced inspection tours. But this visit was also personal. He was here to see Salimata and Sulemana, who were visiting the hospital for Sulemana's 6-month follow-up examination. The reunion was warm and informal, with Sulemana running to embrace the man he knew as Uncle Ibrahim, while Salimata, now 11 years old and even more articulate than before, prepared to deliver her assessment of whether the government had kept its promises. "Uncle Ibrahim," she said with the seriousness that had characterized her even as a 10-year-old, "I have been watching the reports on television and talking to people in our neighborhood. I think you are keeping your promises, but there are still some problems." Ibrahim sat down to listen attentively, recognizing that this child's evaluation was likely to be more accurate than many of the official reports he received. "The hospital is much better now, and children don't have to pay when they're sick." But some of the older people still can't afford their medicine, and in some villages, the mobile clinics don't come often enough. Her observations were insightful and accurate, reflecting the ongoing challenges that any systematic reform effort would need to address over time, rather than immediately. "You're right, Salimata," Ibrahim responded. "We've made good progress on children's health care, but we still have work to do for adults and for the most remote communities. What do you think we should do about those problems?" The conversation that followed was remarkable for its substance and sophistication. Salimata had clearly been thinking deeply about the healthcare system's remaining challenges, and her suggestions reflected both practical understanding and moral clarity. "I think the mobile clinics should train people in each village to do simple treatments, so they don't have to wait for the doctors to come back," she suggested. "And maybe the government could help older people pay for medicine the same way. It helps children." Ibrahim nodded, recognizing wisdom that had emerged from lived experience rather than academic study. "Those are excellent ideas, Salimata. Would you be willing to help us figure out how to implement them?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "But I have school now, and I want to become a doctor myself someday, so I can help even more children like Suleimana." This ambition, expressed by a child whose educational prospects had been uncertain just months earlier, represented perhaps the most profound success of the reform program. The scholarship fund that had been established for Salimata and Suleimana had grown into a broader initiative supporting the education of children from families affected by medical crises. As the visit continued, Ibrahim observed the hospital's operations with the trained eye of someone who had become genuinely expert in healthcare delivery challenges. He noted the efficient flow of patients through triage, the adequate supplies in the pharmacy, and the confident demeanor of staff members who no longer had to apologize for inadequate resources. But he also paid attention to the subtler indicators of systemic health, the way families interacted with medical staff without the deference born of desperation, the casual confidence with which parents brought children for preventive care rather than waiting until conditions became critical, and the pride that healthcare workers took in their profession now that they could practice it effectively. Dr. Konate joined them for lunch in the hospital cafeteria, where the conversation turned to the broader implications of the healthcare reforms. "What we've discovered," she explained, "is that when you fix one part of a broken system properly, it creates momentum for improvements throughout the entire structure." She pointed to examples beyond healthcare. The transparent procurement processes developed for medical supplies had been adopted by other government departments, reducing corruption and improving efficiency across multiple sectors. The community engagement model used for the mobile clinics had been replicated in agricultural extension services and educational outreach programs. "It's as if the success in healthcare has given people permission to believe that other things can be fixed too," she observed. This spillover effect was indeed visible throughout Burkina Faso. The quarterly reports on healthcare progress had created public expectations for similar transparency and accountability in other areas of government. Citizens who had learned to evaluate medical statistics were now demanding similar data on education outcomes, infrastructure development, and economic indicators. Civil society organizations that had initially focused on supporting the healthcare reforms had expanded their activities to include monitoring and advocacy across the full spectrum of public services. The monthly public forums that Ibrahim had established to discuss healthcare progress had evolved into broader conversations about national development priorities and government accountability. Perhaps most significantly, the success of the reforms had begun to influence regional discussions about governance and development. Other West African leaders were studying the Burkina Faso model, particularly the emphasis on direct presidential engagement with service delivery and the systematic redirection of resources from ceremonial to essential functions. The African Union had invited Ibrahim to present the healthcare reform experience at the next Continental Summit, recognizing it as a potentially replicable model for addressing the healthcare challenges that affected virtually every African nation. But for Ibrahim, the most meaningful validation came not from international recognition, but from encounters like this morning's conversation with Salimata. Her matter-of-fact expectation that government should serve people's needs, combined with her willingness to hold leaders accountable for their promises, represented the kind of civic engagement that sustainable democracy required. As the afternoon wore on, and Ibrahim prepared to continue his hospital tour to other facilities in the region, Salimata approached him with one final observation. "Uncle Ibrahim, when I carried Sulemana to the hospital that morning, I was scared that he would die and that no one would help us. But now when I see sick children, I'm not scared anymore because I know the hospitals will help them. That's the best thing about what you did, not just that you saved my brother, but that you made it so other children won't have to be as scared as I was." This insight, that effective public services provide not just immediate benefits, but also the deeper security of knowing that help is available when needed, captured the essence of what the reforms had accomplished. The transformation had been about more than medical equipment and supply chains. It had been about restoring citizens' confidence in their government's commitment to their well-being. As Ibrahim's convoy departed the hospital, continuing on to visit rural health centers in the surrounding districts, the conversations and observations of the day reinforced his conviction that the path they had chosen was both sustainable and transformative. The healthcare reforms had succeeded not because they were perfect, but because they were based on direct engagement with citizens' actual experiences and needs. The ongoing challenges that Salimata had identified were being addressed through the same process of listening, learning, and adapting that had guided the initial changes. Most importantly, the reforms had created a new relationship between government and citizens, one based on mutual accountability rather than patronage, on transparency rather than opacity, and on service rather than self-interest. This relationship had become the foundation for broader improvements across multiple sectors and had begun to influence how other nations approached similar challenges. 2 years after that first encounter on the dusty road, the story of Salimata and Sulemana had become more than a national legend. It had become a catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The healthcare reforms that began with one child's crisis had evolved into a comprehensive model of governance that was being studied and adapted throughout sub-Saharan Africa. In the small village of Gorom Gorom, near the border with Mali, a new health center bore a plaque that read, "Centre de Santé Salimata Sulemana." The facility, built with funds redirected from canceled government ceremonies and staffed by young doctors who had returned from training abroad, served as a symbol of how individual courage could inspire systemic change. The center's director, Dr. Mariam Sankara, had been among the first wave of diaspora medical professionals to return home after the reforms began. When I saw that the government was serious about providing resources and removing bureaucratic obstacles, she explained to a group of visiting medical students, I knew it was finally time to come back and serve my own people. The impact on communities like Gorom Gorom was profound and measurable. Child mortality rates had plummeted as preventive care became accessible and emergency treatment became reliable. But beyond the health statistics, there was a palpable change in social confidence and community cohesion. Parents no longer live in constant fear that a child's fever might become a death sentence, observed Imam Abdul Karim Ouedraogo, whose mosque had become an informal coordination center for health education in the region. When people stop worrying about basic survival, they can start thinking about improvement and development. This psychological transformation, the shift from survival to development thinking, was perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the healthcare reforms. Communities that had previously focused all their energy on managing crisis were now investing in schools, small businesses, and agricultural improvements. In Ouagadougou, the university hospital had become a teaching facility, attracting medical students from throughout West Africa. The Burkina model, emphasizing practical training in resource-constrained environments, community engagement, and transparent accountability, was being integrated into medical education programs across the region. Dr. Konate, now recognized as one of Africa's leading experts on healthcare system reform, spent half her time traveling to other countries to share lessons learned from the Burkina Faso experience. What we discovered, she told a conference of African health ministers, is that the technical aspects of healthcare reform are actually the easy part. The real challenge is building trust between government and citizens, and that requires leaders who are willing to be personally accountable for results. The accountability mechanisms that had grown out of Ibrahim's promise to Salimata had become a model for transparent governance that extended far beyond healthcare. The monthly progress reports, quarterly public forums, and annual citizen evaluation sessions had created a culture of continuous feedback and improvement that affected all aspects of government performance. International development organizations had taken notice, with several major foundations redirecting their African healthcare investments to support the Burkina Faso model rather than implementing parallel systems. For the first time, noted a World Bank official, we're seeing a locally designed reform program that actually produces the results that external interventions have been trying to achieve for decades. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening in schools throughout Burkina Faso, where children were learning about civic engagement through the story of Salimata's courage and Ibrahim's response. Teachers reported that students were showing increased interest in public service careers and greater confidence in their ability to influence government decisions. At the École Primaire de Sissin, where Salimata was now in her final year before advancing to secondary school, she had become something of a celebrity among younger students who often asked her to tell the story of that morning when she carried her brother to find help. But rather than dwelling on past events, Salimata's conversations with her classmates focused on future possibilities. "When I become a doctor," she would tell them, "I want to make sure that every village has someone who knows how to help sick children. And when I'm old enough to vote, I want to choose leaders who care more about helping people than about having fancy cars and big houses." This civic consciousness, the expectation that government should be accountable and that individual citizens had both rights and responsibilities in making it so, represented perhaps the most profound, long-term impact of the healthcare transformation. A generation of young people was growing up with the understanding that effective governance was both possible and something they could influence. Sulemana, now 7 years old and attending school regularly, had become an informal ambassador for the importance of healthcare access. His presence at public events, healthy, energetic, and articulate, served as living proof of what was possible when systems worked as they should. "I want to be a teacher when I grow up," he announced during one school presentation, "so I can help other children learn that they don't have to be afraid when they get sick, because there will always be someone to help them." The economic impacts of the healthcare reforms were also becoming clear. The World Health Organization estimated that the reduced burden of preventable disease was contributing approximately 1.2% annually to Burkina Faso's GDP growth, as healthier populations were more productive and families spent less money on emergency medical expenses. The Diaspora Engagement Program had attracted more than $50 million in contributions and investments from Burkinabe citizens living abroad, resources that were being used not just for healthcare improvements, but for broader economic development initiatives. When people see that their government is serious about serving citizens rather than enriching officials, explained Dr. Aminata Kabore during one of her periodic visits home from Paris, they become willing to invest in their country's future. International recognition had followed the practical success. Ibrahim had been invited to address the United Nations General Assembly on innovative approaches to healthcare delivery, and Burkina Faso had been selected as a pilot country for several major development initiatives based on its demonstrated capacity for effective implementation. But for Ibrahim personally, the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. During a visit to a rural market, an elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Mr. President," she said, "my granddaughter was born premature last month. 2 years ago, she would have died because the clinic had no equipment to help small babies. But yesterday, she came home healthy and strong. I wanted to thank you not just for saving my granddaughter, but for showing us that government can actually care about people like us." Such encounters, multiplied thousands of times across the country, had convinced Ibrahim that the path chosen that morning when he stopped for Salimata and Sulemana had been the right one. The healthcare reforms had succeeded not because they were technically perfect, but because they had grown out of genuine engagement with citizens' lived experiences and had been sustained through transparent accountability to those citizens. As Ibrahim reflected on the journey from that dusty roadside encounter to the comprehensive transformation that had followed, he was struck by how much had changed not just in Burkina Faso's healthcare system, but in the relationship between government and citizens throughout the country. The success had attracted criticism from some quarters. Political opponents argued that the focus on healthcare had diverted attention from other development priorities. Some international partners worried that the emphasis on free services was financially unsustainable. A few traditional elites resented the redistribution of resources away from ceremonial and patronage expenditures toward direct service delivery, but these criticisms were consistently answered by results that spoke for themselves. Healthcare indicators had improved dramatically. Citizen satisfaction with government performance had reached unprecedented levels, and the economy was growing as resources were redirected toward productive investments rather than consumptive spending. More importantly, the success of the healthcare reforms had created momentum for improvements across multiple sectors. Education outcomes were improving, as the same principles of transparent accountability and resource efficiency were applied to schools. Infrastructure development was accelerating as communities organized to support projects they knew would benefit them directly, rather than serving primarily symbolic purposes. 5 years after Salimata carried her brother through the streets of Ouagadougou, she was preparing for her final examinations before advancing to university studies. At 16, she had grown into a confident young woman whose intelligence and determination had been nurtured by educational opportunities that would have been impossible before the broader reforms that grew out of the healthcare transformation. Chaiter, scholarship program that had supported her education, had evolved into a comprehensive system ensuring that no child was denied schooling due to economic hardship. Like the healthcare reforms, this program was funded through the systematic redirection of government resources from ceremonial to essential functions, demonstrating the sustainability of prioritizing citizens' needs over political symbolism. On a warm Saturday morning, Salimata was reviewing her biology notes when she received a phone call that would connect her story to the next generation of young people facing healthcare crises. A mother in the Kadiogo province was seeking help for her infant son, who was suffering from the same respiratory condition that had nearly killed Sulemana years earlier. But this time, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. The mobile clinic network identified the child's condition quickly. The emergency transport system moved him to the appropriate facility within hours, and the free emergency care program ensured that treatment began immediately without regard to the family's ability to pay. Dr. Sulemana Ouedraogo, now practicing at the pediatric specialty center that had been established at the university hospital, was able to provide the kind of expert care that had once been available only to the wealthy or to those lucky enough to encounter presidential convoys at moments of crisis. The difference now, Dr. Ouedraogo explained to a group of medical students observing the treatment, is that what happened to save Sulemana 5 years ago now happens routinely for every child who needs it. That's what systematic change accomplishes. It makes miracles ordinary. The transformation extended beyond individual cases to encompass the entire healthcare ecosystem. Medical schools throughout West Africa were now sending students to Burkina Faso, for practical training in community-based healthcare delivery. The country had become a regional center for medical education, research, and policy development. International health organizations had established regional offices in Ouagadougou to coordinate programs based on the Burkina model. The World Health Organization's African Regional Office had relocated several key programs to Burkina Faso in recognition of the country's demonstrated capacity for effective health system management. But perhaps most significantly, the healthcare success had catalyzed broader democratic development throughout the country. The accountability mechanisms pioneered in health sector governance had been extended to education, agriculture, infrastructure, and economic development. Citizens had learned to expect transparent reporting, regular evaluation, and responsive adjustment of policies based on evidence of what worked and what didn't. The political impact was profound. Electoral participation had increased dramatically as citizens developed confidence that their votes could influence government performance. Civil society organizations had proliferated and become more sophisticated in their monitoring and advocacy roles. The media had evolved from primarily reporting on political personalities to focusing on policy outcomes and their impact on ordinary citizens' lives. International observers noted that Burkina Faso had become a model for how African democracies could develop indigenous approaches to governance that emphasized service delivery and citizen engagement over the formal institutions that had been transplanted from other contexts with limited success. The economic benefits were equally impressive. The improved health and education outcomes had attracted increased foreign investment as international companies recognized the value of operating in a country with healthy, educated workers and effective government institutions. GDP growth had averaged over 6% annually for 3 consecutive years, with the benefits distributed more equitably than in previous periods of economic expansion. The Diaspora Engagement Program had evolved into a comprehensive network connecting Burkinabe citizens abroad with development opportunities at home. Rather than the traditional pattern of brain drain, Burkina Faso was experiencing significant brain circulation as educated citizens maintained connections with their home country and many returned permanently to contribute to its development. The 5th anniversary of that first encounter between Ibrahim and Salimata, a national celebration was organized not as a political event, but as a community festival recognizing the collective achievements that had grown out of individual courage and responsive leadership. The celebration took place not in the capital's grand venues, but in hospitals, schools, and health centers throughout the country where the real transformation had occurred. In each location, the festivities focused on recognizing the healthcare workers, teachers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens whose daily efforts had sustained the reforms over 5 years. At the university hospital where the story had reached, its first climax, a new children's wing, was dedicated with a simple inscription, "In honor of Salimata Ouedraogo, whose courage reminded us that leadership means caring for the least among us, and in memory of all the children whose lives could have been saved if we had acted sooner." Ibrahim, now in his 6th year as president and facing the constitutional term limit that he had pledged to respect, used the anniversary speech to reflect on what the healthcare transformation had taught about leadership and governance. 5 years ago, a little girl taught me that true leadership is not about giving speeches or attending ceremonies. He told the gathered crowd in the hospital courtyard where his historic address had taken place. It's about stopping when you encounter someone in need and doing whatever is necessary to help them. He paused, looking toward the front row where Salimata sat with her family, including Sulemana, who was now a healthy 12-year-old preparing for his own secondary school examinations. But more importantly, that little girl taught an entire nation that ordinary citizens have the power to hold their leaders accountable and to demand that government serve their needs rather than its own interests. The crowd responded with sustained applause, but Ibrahim raised his hand to continue. As my term as president nears its end, I want to be very clear about something. The changes we have achieved belong to all of you, not to any individual leader. They will continue because they are based on principles and systems, not on personalities. And they will expand because new leaders will emerge who understand that true power comes from serving others rather than being served by them. This commitment to institutional continuity rather than personal perpetuation represented perhaps the most important aspect of the transformation that had begun with healthcare reform. By building systems based on transparency, accountability, and citizen engagement, rather than on personal relationships and patronage, the changes had become sustainable beyond any individual leader's tenure. The presidential election scheduled for the following year would test this sustainability. Early polls suggested that citizens were less interested in charismatic personalities than in candidates who demonstrated concrete commitments to continuing and expanding the service delivery improvements they had come to expect. Salimata, now eligible to vote for the first time, had become an informal spokesperson for her generation's expectations of political leadership. "We want leaders who will listen to us like President Ibrahim listened to me," she explained in an interview with a regional television network. "Not leaders who just make promises, but leaders who will sit with us when we're in trouble and work with us to find solutions." As the anniversary celebrations concluded and the country began preparing for the democratic transition that would test the durability of its transformation, the story of Salimata and Sulemana continued to serve as a touchstone for understanding what responsive government could accomplish when it prioritized citizens' needs over political convenience. The healthcare system that had failed them so dramatically 5 years earlier now stood as one of the most effective in West Africa. More importantly, the principles that had guided its transformation, direct engagement with citizens' experiences, transparent accountability for results, and systematic redirection of resources toward essential services, had become the foundation. For governance improvements across multiple sectors, their story had become more than a tale of individual courage and responsive leadership. It had become a demonstration that sustainable development was possible when government institutions were designed to serve citizens rather than to serve themselves, and when citizens were empowered to hold their leaders accountable for results rather than rhetoric. As Salimata prepared for university studies in medicine, and Sulemana continued his education in the expectation that quality healthcare would always be available when needed, their experience stood as proof that the transformation which began with one child's crisis could indeed change an entire nation's trajectory toward justice, prosperity, and hope. The story of Ibrahim Traoré, Salimata, and Sulemana represents more than a narrative of successful healthcare reform. It illustrates the transformative power that emerges when political leadership encounters human need with genuine empathy and sustained commitment to systemic change. What began as an individual act of compassion, a president stopping his convoy to help a child in crisis, evolved into a comprehensive demonstration of how governance can serve human development when leaders choose to prioritize citizens' well-being over political convenience, when resources are redirected from ceremonial consumption to essential services, and when accountability mechanisms ensure that promises are kept rather than forgotten. The healthcare transformation in Burkina Faso succeeded not because it was technically perfect or fully funded, but because it was grounded in direct engagement with citizens' lived experiences and sustained through transparent accountability to those it served. The monthly progress reports, quarterly public forums, and annual citizen evaluations created a relationship between government and people based on mutual responsibility rather than patronage or indifference. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that sustainable change requires both courageous leadership and empowered citizenship. Salimata's determination to carry her brother to safety, combined with her willingness to hold the president accountable to his promises, exemplifies the kind of civic engagement that democracy requires to function effectively. The ripple effects extended far beyond healthcare to influence education, infrastructure, economic development, and democratic governance throughout Burkina Faso and increasingly throughout the West African region. When one sector of government begins to work effectively in service of citizens' needs, it creates momentum for improvement across all sectors and raises expectations for responsive governance generally. The international recognition that followed was significant not because it brought prestige, but because it demonstrated that African nations could develop indigenous approaches to governance and development that achieved better results than externally imposed solutions. The Burkina model became a reference point for other countries seeking to transform rhetoric about people-centered development into practical reality. But the most enduring legacy may be generational, the example set for young people throughout Africa that government can be responsive to citizens' needs, that individual courage can catalyze systemic change, and that holding leaders accountable is both possible and necessary for democratic development. As Salimata prepares to begin her medical studies and Sulemana grows up expecting that healthcare will be available when needed, they represent a generation that has learned to expect competent, accountable governance as a normal part of citizenship rather than as an impossible dream. Their story continues to inspire citizens throughout Africa and beyond to demand that their leaders prioritize human development over personal enrichment, to insist on transparency and accountability in government operations, and to understand that sustainable change requires both responsive leadership and active citizenship working together toward shared goals. The promise of dawn that began with a little girl carrying her brother through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou has become a sustained transformation that proves democracy can work when leaders remember they are servants rather than masters, and when citizens accept the responsibility to hold those leaders accountable for serving the common good. In a continent too often characterized by failed leadership and disappointed citizens, the story of how healthcare reform catalyzed broader democratic development in Burkina Faso offers hope that other nations can achieve similar transformations when they commit to putting human dignity and development at the center of governance. The most powerful lesson may be the simplest. When leaders stop their convoys to help children in crisis, and when those children grow up empowered to hold leaders accountable for keeping their promises, entire nations can transform themselves from examples of failed potential to models of what African democracy can accomplish when it serves its people rather than exploiting them. This is the enduring promise of the story, that leadership rooted in compassion, sustained by accountability, and measured by its impact on the most vulnerable can indeed change not just individual lives, but the trajectory of nations toward justice, prosperity, and hope for all their citizens.